Good morning, I'm Florence Eshalomi. Welcome to the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee. Can I ask my colleagues on the committee to introduce themselves, please?
Mayor Ellis, Ribble Valley.
Good morning, Andrew Lewin, Welland Hatfield.
Chris Curtis, Milton Keynes North.
Michelle Bacan, Gillingham and Raynham.
Joe Powell, Kensington and Bayswater.
Sarah Smith, Hindburn.
Will Forster, Woking.
Scott in Broxton, and I'm also still a Hertfordshire County Councillor.
Gag Mahinder, South West Hertfordshire.
Thank you. Can I ask our guests to introduce themselves, please, for hands up?
My name is Maurice Lange. I'm an analyst at the Centre for Cities think tank.
I'm Dr. Thomas Aubrey. I'm a visiting fellow at the LSE.
John Kavanagh, Programme Director for Infrastructure at Business London.
I'm Chris Whitehouse, a Technical Director at WSP.
Thank you. Our committee is now looking at the issue of land value capture and how we help the government with their really ambitious target of building 1.5 million new homes, and boosting affordable housing element of those homes is really important. And it's an ambition that's shared by many across the sector, within the housing sector. And one of those areas comes from the Section 106 element. Just looking at the current value and system in place, I'll ask an opening question to all of you. Based on your research and some of the findings that you've all been looking at and looking at benefits and shortcomings, what do you think are the main benefits of the current Section 106 regime across England?
I'm happy to go first. If you're speaking about the benefits in a broad sense, you'd think about site specificity of Section 106 and the fact that there's good evidence that it has achieved a good amount of land value capture, and that's increased over the last couple of decades. Our research has focused on quantifying what potential land value capture could be, and so then you can estimate the difference between what potential says and then what is actually being achieved. We focused on modelling land value capture on large greenfield sites because that's where most development happens and most land value capture potential exists. So our headline finding is that the current regime is performing less well than it could compared to the potential that we identify in the model, but that is focused in high value locations only. So to explain that a bit more, the effectiveness of a land value capture regime will be to do with, firstly, how much land value capture it achieves on any given development, and then secondly, whether that mechanism encourages or discourages development happening at all. So the majority of the underperformance, as we identify as compared to the model, is to do with the first one. So in high value locations, we're simply not getting as much land value capture as we could. We think that in high value locations, for example, the Greater South East, most places would be considered a high value location. You could achieve, if you put it in affordable housing terms, 40 to 50%, and on average we're achieving about 19% at the moment. Elsewhere in the country, it's a much less clear picture that the system could currently be improved. Our models, compared to reality, there's not much difference. So it's mostly in those high-value locations where there's a difference. And then to address the second component as to how much development is happening, part of the underperformance is to do with building not happening at all. So let's say you had the same land value capture systems in place, but more development happened, you would get more land value capture occurring. So there are some places in the Greater South East where you could both boost house building and improve the mechanism, and that would be the total of achieving the potential, if that makes sense.
I'll go next. So some of the research I've done in the past have estimated that if you're looking at Section 106 and SIL, but also if you're generating profits from the development process, you'll be paying out taxes through capital gains tax or corporation tax. I estimate about 42% of the uplifted land values has been captured by the state, whether it's by central government or local government. And that's quite similar to Professor Tony Rook's top-down analysis, and he reckoned about 49% was being captured. So I think a reasonable estimate will be probably just slightly less than half is being captured through our current mechanisms. And as Maurice said, I think Section 106 and SIL has certainly been a reasonably successful method of capturing land values for the speculative house building model. But I think it is worth pointing out that there are different models of development and building houses where you can use different mechanisms to capture the land uplift as well.
Just to add, I think that Section 106 and SIL and other mechanisms sort of have their role. So a version of the community infrastructure levy was introduced in London, the mayoral community infrastructure levy, and that was alongside Section 106 responsible for around £1.5 billion of funding that went into the Crossrail project for the Elizabeth line. So they can make a significant contribution, and especially if they're applied in a certain way. I think the thing that we would say is that the current structures that we have, the current mechanisms, the current taxes, they're only ever going to make a contribution. They're never going to fund in whole the infrastructure that we need to unlock the development at the scale we need to meet the government's ambition for 1.5 million homes. So hence, and we'll come on to the sort of model that we're looking at, broadening the range of tools that you have available to better capture value uplift.
Thanks. I'd just add to that, just to those observations that clearly the Section 106 is an upfront cost to the developer. So there, as I think has been touched on, does then sort of raise issues about the viability and sort of trade-offs in terms of what the development can deliver. So there's consideration of the timing of when land capture is realised. And also, which can be a positive, sort of the site-specific element to it, but also that can lead to very sort of bespoke agreements and discussions, and can be a resource burden on the local authorities and the developers, and can be a bit sort of confrontational rather than sort of being a collaborative approach.
So just on that, Chris, do you think it's a bit restrictive then? Because again, we have had examples where essentially you've had issues where developers and authorities haven't been able to agree on the Section 106, the fact that you've got sales are agreed in advance, and it's only set for specific developments. So again, a bit of restrictions there.
I think it can be a bit restrictive because the intent is that you are mitigating the impact on the transport network from your development. So there are going to be potentially different views on what the impact is, and that can lead into exercise of modelling sort of for and against almost the development, and then the sort of definition of what the measures are, and they potentially can end up being quite localised, while potentially the local authority might have sort of more strategic plans that it'd like to be able to put the contribution towards from the Section 106, but it's sort of a more localised element to it. So I think it has a role to play, but I don't think it's obviously not the best solution in all circumstances.
Maurice, you touched on obviously the issues with sort of London and South East, where you can release some of the land. I think I represent an inner London constituency. Look at the values there compared to other parts. How do you think the value is captured across England in comparison to, say, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland? Is this an area that needs a lot more thought and for us to drill down on?
So I guess there's the observation that land value capture potential, sort of the maximum that you could possibly achieve, varies in space, and then you have the fact that outcomes vary in space. We think that you should only expect land value capture to do as much as you should expect it to do, if that makes sense. And that depends on the house prices that there are in a given place and the differences between house prices and costs. So house prices vary significantly across the country, as we all know, and costs vary less than that, especially if you're looking at comparing a greenfield site outside London versus a greenfield site outside Newcastle. Those don't cost that much different to build out. And so you've got this sort of observable fact which land value capture does vary in space. My research is focused on England, so I can't really speak to performance across devolved nations, but the same observation would be true in those places where you should expect things to happen where house prices are higher, but across a lot of those nations, house prices don't support a large amount of land value capture, if that makes sense.
So just moving on to a bit about land assembly, and I guess this question is, Maurice, for you first. What do you think would be the potential benefits of a more widespread land assembly by public bodies?
So, as I'd say, you have two key benefits to public land assembly as opposed to land coming to market through only private entities. Firstly is that public authorities have the ability to buy land at a potentially lower price. That is because they have compulsory purchase powers. In a pre-23 world, that already meant that they could buy in a lot of circumstances at an affordable price, but changes through the Levelling Up Act in 2023 and then proposed changes through the Planning and Infrastructure Bill mean that they'll be able to buy affordably in a wider range of circumstances. So there's that, so if we compare what the inferred land price is given our modelling from what's currently achieved to what could be achieved, there's that gap which you could close. And then second advantage is that because you know the public authority has the authority to buy the land, that you could know any given particular land was going to come forward for development. So that could, in theory, increase the amount of land coming forward for development, but it also means it can be where you want it to be. So if we're moving towards a world where we have more spatial development strategies and more local plans which are specifying that we want development happening in XYZ place, the public authorities have greater capacity to assemble land, means that it's more likely that all of those eventualities come to reality. Does that make sense? I'd see sort of other benefits being, if you imagine authorities taking on more of the early stage development role, so they might also do bits of master planning or bits of site preparation, then they are also making it less risky to be a house builder, which means that you could have a wider range of potential developers acting and so you could have more small and medium-sized house builders in the space. We currently have a small number of very big house builders playing an outsized role in our development system. And that, if you have more developers operating, then you have more competition between them for any given piece of land, which could drive up quality, but it also could mean that you have greater assurance that you're maximising land value capture.
That's really helpful. And so just to pick on that then, in terms of, you mentioned the Planning and Infrastructure Bill and the powers that does in terms of extending CPO. Do you think that's sort of gone far enough, or do you think there could be, in its current iteration, or do you think there's potential to have more improvements to support land assembly?
As I would see it, I'm not a local authority and I've not worked for a development corporation, so there's a limit to what I can speak to in terms of the specifics. But as far as I understand it, the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill establishes this principle that in the public interest you can set aside hope value. That's the really important thing, and the Planning and Infrastructure Bill is making tweaks to that to make it more operable in the real world. I'd see the major challenge not necessarily being further changes to the rules, but improvements to capacity to use these rules, to use these powers. So at the moment we have local authorities who have under-resourced planning teams, or we don't have development corporations and so the expertise does not exist in the system to use them as effectively as they could to achieve the outcomes which they potentially could. Does that make sense? So it's a capacity thing as much as rules.
As opposed to legislation. So, and just in terms of the public interest point, I understand from what you said that you think that that CPO should be allowable under that public interest banner. Do you think that government could go further in terms of the guidance on what constitutes as public interest, and would that be more helpful?
Yes, guidance would help people understand exactly what the legislation means. I think, as I understand it, the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill Act says affordable housing, health and education are justifiable public interest grounds, and you can understand that. You could take another view that it could be broader than that, in that let's say you want to fund through land value capture a tram system. That's not delivered on site, that is funded through the system of capturing land value uplifts. You could have an entirely private development which funded that public good. As it's defined currently, you wouldn't be able to do that in the public interest because it's not a specific housing, education and health thing on that specific bit of land. So there's a question about whether or not that guidance or further information could broaden public interest reasons for setting aside hope value.
I wonder if anyone else on the panel has any comments on any element of compulsory purchase or land assembly.
Yeah, I'll just make a couple of points. I think that there's a massive benefit for doing public land assembly, and particularly for integrating housing with transport. This is something that we have not done at all over the last 30 or 40 years, and that's a real problem when you're trying to think about densifying existing urban conurbations or extending existing urban conurbations, where the demand for housing is. I think the other point about doing things at scale is important when you're thinking about putting in new infrastructure. Many developments, particularly sort of subscale ones, have very little benefit for existing residents, which is obviously a problem when it comes to them wanting to oppose development. Whereas if you're doing things at scale, you're providing existing or new benefits for existing residents. And I think the other point around when you're thinking about land assembly at scale is the financial modelling becomes much more viable. The returns to infrastructure, they do matter. When you're trying to do things at subscale, the economics just don't work. So I think that's a really important part of land assembly. I think Section 190 in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act has fundamentally transformed the way we think about the potential of deploying these kinds of models through development corporations, which in effect would allow us to go back to that sort of new towns model, which was reasonably successful, at least in delivering large amounts of housing. That model's obviously been sort of replicated across large parts of Europe. In terms of potential guidance, I think one of the important things when you're thinking about these large projects is that you really want to use the threat of the CPO to have a commercial transaction with landowners. I think that maybe having some guidance which makes it clear that certain kinds of large-scale integrated projects with housing and transportation would automatically get a direction from the Secretary of State. I think that would be useful, but I think it's important when you're thinking through these challenges is that it would need to be such a large scale that it couldn't compete with a private developer, because that has implications for the CPO rules as well. So I think a large...
Can I just do a quick follow-up? So just in terms of changing behaviours, in terms of what the current planning and infrastructure bill is proposing in terms of reforms to CPO, do you think there is a potential to change behaviour, but it needs to be done at that kind of on scale sort of...
Yeah, I mean, look, the Section 190 is already there, so, but what we're not seeing is projects coming through. Now, maybe combined authorities feel less confident about doing it. It's hard to know. Obviously, it's not been tested yet in law. But I think that would be maybe slightly more helpful, let's say, for the financial director of one of these development corporations, thinking through, will our direction to the Secretary of State be accepted or not? Obviously, if you had more certainty that would be accepted, the viability of that project is far more likely to proceed. So I think those kinds of things are important, but I would just say that when you're trying to think through how to legislate for that, you want to ensure that it's done at scale, because clearly that has a much stronger public interest test, and it's also not really possible for private entities to do things at that kind of scale, so you don't get that conflict, which is important for the CPO rules.
Anyone else on that? No. Moving on. Thank you. Moving on to Gaga.
Thank you. My question is going to be firstly directed at John Chris. It's to do with financing. Both your respective organisations created a report earlier this year about tax incremental financing. Can you just, for the panel, articulate what that means and what the benefits are for it?
Okay, I'll set out. The recommendations we identified were threefold, as you say. It was looking to evolve tax increment financing, so looking to generate a future revenue stream that you could then use to pay back upfront borrowing. So the three recommendations that the study identified we dubbed as Resi TIF, Commercial TIF and Combined TIF. And this relates to the type of land use that could be unlocked by major transport infrastructure investment. So the first recommendation, or I should say that the study was focused on London, working with London councils, TfL and Business London, but our view is that the recommendations are relevant and applicable across the nation. So that the first recommendation was that the Mayor would have powers to introduce a Resi TIF through which they would get to retain an element, a proportion of stamp duty land tax from the properties which are developed following the unlocking of the site through the infrastructure investment. And potentially there would be the opportunity also to take a slice of council tax from those new dwellings as well, recognising that council tax is under pressure. The sort of a third option would be whether, as some councils do, introduce a precept, so a bit of a surcharge on the council tax again, to provide a revenue stream tied to residences unlocked by the development. So it's about additionality. The second recommendation is a very similar model, but addressing where commercial development is unlocked, so using business rates or business rate supplements as the means of the revenue stream that could then pay back the upfront borrowing. And then thirdly, it's where you've got a mixed-use development being unlocked. So if you're anticipating unlocking both residential properties and commercial properties, you'd then be able to draw on both those streams to repay the upfront borrowing. So those are sort of the three elements of it. And just to briefly, sort of the rationale behind that was, as part of the study, we looked at existing means for funding development, and we're looking to add to those rather than replace them, so an additional tool in the toolbox. And also looking at not imposing for upfront costs on the developers and issuing and challenges that can be caused in terms of trying to balance affordable housing and the viability. So looking at the timing of it, and also through this approach, it is directly tied to the specific land value uplift that is achieved, because it is based on sale prices. So those are the sort of broad recommendations that we came up with.
Yeah, I think just to add again, I think so we modelled the approach against 3 transport schemes in London. So that was the DLR extension to Thamesmead, the Bakerloo line extension, and the West London Orbital. And we estimated that there could be a potential funding pot of around £4.5 billion that you could generate from this model to tap into to help to part fund those infrastructure projects. And if you did fund those infrastructure projects, they would have huge economic benefits, 100,000 homes between them, 10,000 metres squared of commercial office space, benefits for supply chains, job creation, accessibility. I think the key thing is that the model would make a contribution. Again, it would part fund. We're not suggesting that it would wholly fund these projects. And I think, as Chris said, it's important to remember that the revenue would be generated from additional development only. So we would not be taking anything from existing development or existing residents. It would be only from that development that's unlocked directly as a result of the infrastructure being introduced. So that's the additionality point in terms of those properties don't currently exist. You're tapping into potential for new development, new revenue streams through the approach.
So anyone else on the panel wanted to talk about the report? Okay, just a couple of follow-up questions, if I may. Is the intention that TIF funds will only be for things like infrastructure, or could it support other social needs, things like affordable housing?
So yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I think the premise that we started with was that you would end up with a level of affordable housing because you would be able to unlock development with the TIF approach. So unless you get to a situation where you can invest in the infrastructure to unlock development, then you don't get to a conversation about the proportion of affordable housing in the first place. So it's kind of it wouldn't directly fund affordable housing, but you would get to a stage where you would unlock significant levels of development, and a proportion of that development would be affordable based on a negotiation at the local level on the site-specific sort of attributes of that development. So I think it's about saying that there isn't enough development happening at the moment, and that's part of the reason that we don't have the levels of affordable housing we need. So can we fund the infrastructure in an innovative way? And if we do that, we'll unlock greater levels of development, and therefore you will lead to greater levels of affordable housing further down the line. And also, it's not just about the sites that you would unlock in the sort of first instance. You could use the TIF on a recurring basis to unlock additional infrastructure, build new connectivity out, and therefore you could have a higher proportion of affordable housing in the next 10, 15, 20 years as opposed to sort of right now. So there's potential for it to develop that over the long term.
And is government supportive of this at the moment? It was released in January, so it's been several months now.
So we have engaged with MHCLG and DFT, but I'm not aware of what their current thoughts are.
Look forward to my Labour colleagues supporting. Thank you.
I should have declared an interest because obviously Bakerloo line goes through my constituency, and I'm supportive of the Bakerloo line extension. Just to follow up on Gagan's point, obviously this would work well because we've got higher land values in London. Do you think the TIF model could be replicated across England?
Yes, I think we, again, in some obviously discussions earlier, recognise that land values do vary across the nation, across the regions, but picking up John's point, this is seen as being another contributor as a way to fund it rather than funding the whole scheme. So see it sort of being relevant to combined mayoral authorities and across the regions.
So I'll add one point to that as well. I think that when you're looking at these large-scale projects, the financial modelling that I've done on a couple of them is that you really have to look at all potential sources of revenue. And I think that business rate supplements has to be and is going to be, I'm sure, an important contribution to it. But on its own, it's not going to resolve these issues. But when you start to bring together different forms of revenue streams, whether it be business rates plus selling off land plots with planning permission to developers, which is where you would get a lot amount of land value capture through a plan-led model, as well as the receipts from new transportation, which obviously was partly the way that Crossrail was funded, in addition to affordable housing receipts. When you put all those cash flows together over a long period, it does start to make these large-scale projects viable. So I think one of the sort of ways of thinking through this is not just to say, oh, it's land value capture or tier 4 this. I think we need to be thinking about the costs and the revenues, and all of these provide a lot of potential to make these projects viable. It's very rare that you come across a project and there's one silver bullet as a way of allowing you to fund these things. It's just not how these large-scale projects work in general.
Then in such a volatile market that we see now, especially where a number of applications have been approved but not built out, we see issues around business rates, the varying and long-running discussions around revaluation and looking at business rates and the future of business rates. Is there an element, or is there a potential that and a risk that overestimating these future projected income streams could have an impact on the same developments that we're trying to see? Could there be a case where some of the future income is then, the liability sits with council taxpayers, local council taxpayers? I think of the example that always pops up on BBC London of the pub in Camden for HS2 that was CPO'd and nothing's happened yet.
No, it's a very, very important question. I mean, I think one thing I would say is that when you get down to, say, issuing a bond prospectus, you have to have very clear, legal basis for these future cash flows, etc. So if you are going to set up a project, it needs to be clear that those business rates are hypothecated back through to that special purpose vehicle. But clearly every project's going to have certain risks. I mean, the biggest risk might be that suddenly the demand for housing in that area collapses and nobody wants to live there. So, but I think most investors, when they're looking to, say, buy a 40-year bond, will be looking at the robustness of those cash flows, the location. Let's say you're doing something on the Oxford-Cambridge corridor. What's the likelihood that Oxford and Cambridge are going to be reasonably robust economies in 40 years' time? I think most investors will look at that and think it's probably a reasonable bet. But clearly, I think as you get down into the detail of the financing of all of these projects, those things will definitely come up. And I think the important point is that you have to make sure it's clear to the investors that there is a lot of certainty in those future cash flows coming through. So it's a very important point.
Just a very quick follow-up on the use of stamp duty. Has there ever been a similar kind of forward use of future stamp duty?
Securitisation happens in finance a lot.
But here?
I'm not aware of it having been used. What
would the Treasury say to like? Would they be worried about setting a precedent? Like, how would
He's always worried.
I mean, we are aware that our understanding is that there has tended to be a view not to go down the hypothecation route previously, but because we sort of, from the research, you can see the clear link between transport infrastructure and the result of it, and I think probably the consensus there's the need to find new ways for funding these schemes to help economic growth and housing, that it is a new way of doing things. It's an evolved way of doing things. I would say that discussions with Treasury are hopefully starting, but we'd have to wait and see.
Yeah, I think the point, Joe, on that is I think the point we've tried to make to Treasury, and we've had good conversations with them on it, is that it's not substitutional, so we're not suggesting redirecting existing stamp duty. We're suggesting that you grow the funding pot, you sort of grow the size of the pie almost, because you unlock additional development that wouldn't happen anyway. So it's not substitutional, it's always additional. And I think the other key point is, for Treasury, for example, is if you can unlock significant scale of development through a residential TIF, then you broaden the tax base anyway. So you get future income for the Exchequer from that development, whether that's future stamp duty transactions that will happen 10 years down the line. For example, we based the modelling that we did on one transaction per property, but in reality over a 25-year period, if you have an enterprise zone for 25 years, which we've modelled in the report, you're likely to have multiple transactions of stamp duty within that period, and that will accrue back to the Treasury. So it's potentially a short-term issue for long-term benefit.
Yes.
Yeah, but is that not just overcomplicating the system? So we're going to the Treasury to basically say, well, this future tax income you're going to get, we can put towards the debt. Well, why don't we just get the Treasury to fund the infrastructure anyway? Because they're getting the stamp duty. So we're not just creating another level of bureaucracy to go through all of that. Just have the business case, go to government with, this is how much we need to do this, because they're going to get the stamp duty anyway, no?
Yeah. It's a good challenge, Lewis. I think the challenge is that the funding just isn't coming forward. So we're all aware that public finances are extremely stretched. The Chancellor has done what she can in terms of extending the fiscal rules, for example, to allow more borrowing. But the level of public spending and public investment is not coming forward at the scale at which it needs to unlock the scale of development that we need in London and in other cities. And so, if we're just going to purely rely on sort of historical examples of where Treasury has sort of centrally funded things, then we're going to end up in the same sort of situation with low levels of house building. I don't know if Tom or anyone wants to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think the other point is that if you read the NAO's reports around how we funded, central government funding of large-scale infrastructure projects, the results have not been great. I think there's a big governance issue if you're trying to drive this stuff from the centre. Whereas if you've got specific projects with specific costs and hypothecated cash flows, you tend to get a much more orientation of the aligning of incentives, and so therefore the governance is generally much better. And again, if you look across Europe, some of these large-scale projects, they're generally not funded directly from, say, a central government pot. They are much more funded directly from the capital markets or, with other various forms of revenues and costs. So I think that's just one challenge, that if you want to do it from central government, I don't think we really have the governance arrangements in place for that to be successful. I think HS2 is probably the best example of that.
Let's not start there. Moving on to new towns, Chris.
I'll move on to new towns, but I think that's probably a good place to start, Tom. How do we avoid those problems with new towns, which are effectively public bodies?
I think that I would just say a couple of things. Is that one is that in terms of the demand for where new housing is going to be, I think densifying and extending existing urban conurbations will certainly reduce some of the risk. But I think coming back to then the delivery of those projects, any large-scale infrastructure projects has got significant risks. But I think that the Development Corporation, has a history, at least in the UK, of being able to do these kinds of things. But I think it goes back to a point that Maurice made earlier, which is, we need to be having 150, 200 developed planners in these, development corporations to deliver these kinds of things, above and beyond the financing and funding. So, I think the financing and funding is doable. So therefore, it just comes back to the delivery of that, which does come back to capacity.
So just to link these 2 points together, sort of what John was kind of implying, I think, in his previous comments was TIF is kind of a way of getting stuff off the government balance sheet to pay for infrastructure projects, right? Are we not going to sort of run into that problem with new towns if they are public bodies? If they're going to have to borrow money in order to put the land together and acquire it, but isn't that going to run into fiscal rule problems?
Yeah, it's a really important point. So one of the international accounting
or treasury stinginess generally.
Yeah, it's a good point. So the European system of accounts, which is the most important public finance accounting system, if you have a public corporation, what happens is that there's a requirement to assess whether the funding of the debt of that public corporation comes from market agents or it comes from taxation or debt. And so the rules state that if it's more than 50% is coming from market agents, is off balance sheet. That's why that a lot of these European projects have generally been off balance sheet, and why the stock of infrastructure has been so much higher as a percentage of GDP than in the UK. So I think from the UK's perspective, if we want to follow the internationally recognised accounting standard, which pretty much most countries do, there would be a way, as long as you've got sufficient market sources of funding, and market sources of funding include selling off land to house builders with planning permission, affordable housing receipts, as well as ticketing receipts from new transport systems. And business rates obviously is a tax, so that would always be on balance sheet. But you wouldn't expect business rates to pay for more than 10 or 15% of these projects anyway. So the ONS is required to look at each of these debt issuance and make a decision as whether it's funded by market agents or not. So there is a mechanism already that, should we want to utilise it.
Why hasn't that been happening with development corporations in recent years?
I don't really know the answer to that, but I think it's probably something to do with the 74 court ruling with Milton Keynes Development Corporation and Myers, which made it financially unviable really to do this model. And I think now that the Levelling Up Act has changed that, I think it gives us the opportunity to do it. But I think because we haven't been doing it, we haven't really thought through the mechanics of exactly the questions that you're asking.
Just Maurice, very quickly, do you have any views on how we can maximise or how we can do the good land value capture as we sort of create these development corporations and build these new towns?
I don't have anything particularly to add to what I and Tom have already said about the virtues of public land assembly. It's about having a vehicle which is able to use the powers which public authorities have to assemble land relatively cheaply. We have development corporations as the expected vehicle for large-scale urban extensions. The Planning and Infrastructure Bill adds some flexibility to what they are able to do. They can manage multiple sites at the same time. New town development corporations are also able to manage large urban extensions. That's all useful stuff. But it's mostly about actually doing it and building the capacity to do it as opposed to any of the rules around it.
Just sort of final point, if anyone wants to make any comments on it. I think many of my northern colleagues get quite frustrated with some of the infrastructure spending from government being so concentrated in the south of England, and the Treasury always seeming to find money for infrastructure projects in the southeast and never find money for a Leeds tram, right? Do you think this could be a potentially helpful solution for this? Because it can mean that the southeast pays its way a lot more if you do land value capture, which can then free up government infrastructure spending to be invested in projects in the north.
Yes, notwithstanding the issue with where finance comes from, because you don't expect you're going to need, you can assume land value capture will pay for these developments, and my modelling suggests that across the Great South East and in some other locations, that new towns can be self-funding entities. And so therefore that's good from a Treasury point of view in the long term, but you've still got to manage this question, as Tom was saying, about that initial finance, and if that's going to come from the Treasury, then that still looks like uneven spending by central government, and so it's about
how much money, what kind of figures are you talking for that initial cash investment, if you were to make a guess, Tom?
Well, obviously there'd needs a little cash investment to get a development corporation up and running, but to build a large urban extension with a new mass transit system, we're talking about 15 to 20 billion pounds probably, but that'll be over a 40-year period. So
how much would the Treasury probably need to put in at the start in order to
tens of millions in terms of just getting a development corporation up and running, to have some people in, to get some plans together, because once the plans are there, then you can go to the capital market and raise the money that you'd need to then fund the ongoing management of it. So I don't think it's a lot. I think it does. The question does come back to, I think, the point you raised earlier, Chris, which is when you go to the capital market, let's say you wanted to do a mass transit across, build out Cambridge, for example, the Treasury's got to be comfortable that that we want to adhere to international accounting standards, and therefore if the ONS says that this is market
say that's the most important thing.
I think so, because then it goes away, and obviously it wouldn't impact gilt yields. The Treasury is rightly concerned about gilt yields, as they should be, but if you're funding the expansion of Cambridge through a separate bond issuance, it shouldn't be impacting gilt yields at all, which is obviously something that they're going to be interested in.
Mm-hmm. One of the other things, just going on sort of potential locations for new towns, is obviously the issue around Greenbelt. Some of the sites identified would be on Greenbelt land. Do you think that would be a problem in terms of bringing development forward?
Would it be a problem in practical terms, or would it be a problem in sort of the hypothetical? The hypothetical, absolutely not. When it comes to locating new towns, centre cities, we kind of have three basic principles. One is that you would follow house prices to give it the greatest chance of being self-funding. You're also probably then building lots of houses where there's demand, if you take prices to be an indicator of demand. Secondly, you should attach them to existing pools of labour rather than trying to create new economies. You can grow a labour pool and benefit from agglomeration economies. And then thirdly, it should be public transport oriented. And if you tick all of those boxes, I create a map which looks like 90% of the places that are around London are good. They're in the green belt. And so if you think that those are good reasons upon which you choose your locations, then you have to think about releasing greenbelt land. It doesn't mean that all of the greenbelt gets built on, though. In my model, I have 1.1 to 1.5 million homes locations around London. That is, and 83% of them or something is in the greenbelt, but that is only 7% of total London greenbelt land. So most of your greenbelt remains, undeveloped in that scenario. So yes, it requires a review of the greenbelt, and those are often the best locations.
Thank you. Andrew.
Thank you, Chair. Land value capture is obviously not a new subject, so as we sort of wrap up our session, I'm really keen to hear from each of you on a lesson that you would apply from history and how we might do things differently this time around.
So concerns are often raised about efforts in the past to have a general land value capture mechanism, so an infrastructure levy or a land development tax, and they become political footballs, or they don't achieve as much as they should because they're very general, because you have different amounts of land value capture that you can achieve between different sites and between different geographies. So the greatest potential for improvement is on place-based or site-specific mechanisms. At the moment, Section 106 is our main mechanism by which we do that, but you could take a more plan-led public land assembly model, as Tom and I have spoken about, to improve on that front. So that would be one lesson. And then secondly, if you're talking about the application of public land assembly models, if you look at the new towns that were built in the post-war period, those that adhered to where land values were higher and were oriented around where economic geography would point them towards being more useful, those around London and the Great South East, they grew more than the ones in the north. The north was declining economically at the time. If you take that as a lesson in terms of what the likely house building contribution of that kind of mechanism might be, following land values is probably a good place to start.
I think, Andrew, just from our perspective, I'd point to the TfL submission in this respect as well. There's a section there which points to, I think there's been 7 different types of development taxation introduced since 1945, and I won't list them, but there are various in there you can read up. But I think part of the reason that the TfL, and we would agree with this, point to this, is the absence of cross-party support. In that an initiative or legislation has been introduced and then scrapped by another government that's come in, and the sort of elephant in the room of HS2 is another example of that in terms of rowing back on original commitments and providing that long-term stability and removing politics from the process, I think, is one of the lessons.
And do you think that's stopping landowners coming forward? Because essentially there's no clarity, and it could be that by the time that another government could come in and that policy will change again.
Yeah, quite possibly, Chair. So I think it's relevant for all kinds of investment, all kinds of spending, whether you're talking about private investment or landowners committing to new funding models. If they think that the goalposts will change by the term of each parliament, then that's going to affect their long-term outlook. And so as much as you can provide that long-term certainty and stability, that will help to deliver investment we need for the housing we need.
Is there any international precedent where you think you can see a positive change over the last couple of decades, where there has been a big shift in land value capture, broad political consensus, and you've seen the results? That's to anyone on the panel.
I guess so. If you're concerned that changes to a system to try and improve land value capture might have adverse effects because it disrupts a model, that is a reality. There are some actors who bring land forward for development currently whose business model would be undermined if you had more public bodies buying land cheaply. So that points to the fact that you would need commensurate change by those public authorities and their capacity to act in the way that we're expecting them to, such that that does not occur and you continue to have a flow of land for development. So it's really about the capacity to do these things and to act as the rules would have you best achieve. If you look at the Netherlands, they went from a standing start to building literally hundreds of urban extensions over a 20-year period. And that was building on a foundation of more established planning capacity, but it was also possible, and they backed that as a project, and it became something that the New Towns project could hear if it was backed commensurately.
Could I just add, on the TIF internationally, as you may well be aware, it's a very common funding and finance model in the US, and they use it for a lot of the infrastructure there, and I couldn't speak about the political consensus, but because they put it out to a public vote as to whether it will be added to the tax base, then they get the consensus on that and use it. And I think going back to the question about some lessons learned or observations, I think it's also just it is sort of that certainty and that familiarity as part of the study. We looked at and TfL provided information on the Northern Line extension to Battersea, and that being a sort of an example of a TIF model working, and some lessons being learnt from that. And one of the observations raised was that was very focused, is very focused on the business rates, and therefore sort of driven, therefore has been more at risk due to the climate for business and commercial property, and therefore I think one of the arguments for our proposals is to provide that flexibility and evolution of it where you're not necessarily just tied to the commercial side of things. So really, as has been said before, just a suggestion that I think sort of lessons learned are to add more opportunities to draw revenue or funding to come up with a sort of a composite pot, because as I said, it's unlikely that one source will ever be sufficient in its own right.
Thank you very much. I think we've had some good points for us to add to our deliberations on that. I'm going to do a changeover for the panel members now. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Welcome back to the second part of our hearing on land value capture. Can I get our guests to introduce themselves, please?
I'm Jeremy Aston, representing the RICS and under our Charter Public Interest.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tom Kennedy, Senior Policy and Research Manager at the Northern Housing Consortium. We represent housing associations, local authorities, ALMOs and combined authorities across the north of England.
Hi, good morning. I'm Anna Hart, Senior Corporate Finance Manager at Transport for London.
And I'm Dr. Hugh Ellis, Head of Policy at the Town and Country Planning Association.
Thank you. Hand over to Will.
Thank you, Chairman. Just wanted to start with, what do you think, how much scope do you think there is for land value capture to assist in the government's policy aims without depressing the housing market? And in particular, what particular approaches on land value capture do you think they should consider?
It's fundamental. Land value capture is the heart of good placemaking, but only when it's linked with other mechanisms like development corporations. It was the heart of the Garden City model, which remains the most successful way of building places this country's ever developed. But there is a paradox, which is that Our current development model, highly speculative housing development model, is subject to SIL and 106 simply by force of pragmatism. So we kind of have to live with that arrangement. But if you can't get that right, essentially you can't create place to the kind of ambition that we would want to deliver. So the first issue, I think, is always about what are you trying to achieve with land value capture? Are you trying to pay for social housing? Are you trying to achieve really good placemaking objectives? But for the TCPA, the economics has always been the heart of it. You can build extraordinary high quality places, but only with an economic model which recycles values in a mutualised approach, and that requires some pretty radical change from where we are.
I would agree with that. So from the public transport investment perspective, obviously we need good public transport to enable sustainable residential development. And in the absence of grant funding to deliver all of the public transport investment that is required, we do need to look at alternative mechanisms, and I think land value capture is a critical component of that innovative funding approach. We know that there is a big body of evidence that shows that public transport leads to significant land value uplifts, but public sector's toolbox of extracting that value uplift is quite limited. We've talked about Section 106, SIL. It is targeting just one of the beneficiaries of public transport investment, the developer community, but it isn't targeting all of the other beneficiaries. TfL has done a lot of work looking at who those beneficiaries are. We can point at businesses, we can point at existing residential land and property owners, and the tools in that space in particular of capturing value are limited. So I think there is a lot to say for trying to establish a holistic approach to land value capture that does look at all beneficiaries and does try to capture an equitable contribution from all, so that we can grow the kind of the pot of funds we've got available to the public sector to deliver the infrastructure that would support the housing.
Agreed with the points made about it being crucial and getting it right will be really important, especially making sure that Section 106 works properly to make sure that we have healthy build-out rates and delivering affordable housing and infrastructure. Also support the use of development corporations and compulsory purchase powers, but I think in the north of England there will always be a limit on how useful it can be because land values are just that much lower. So I'll just have a look at the stats I've got in front of me. So in 2018-19, the north of England collected 13% of all developer contributions with 28% of the population, and London and the south east, that was 53% contributions with 32% of the population. And the result of that is we do just deliver less through land value capture uplift, and councils do already try to maximise what they can. So for affordable housing provision, approximately 30% of new supply in the north was from land value capture, compared to over 50% outside of it. And so in the north we'll just be reliant on grant funding to deliver affordable housing for the foreseeable future. And I don't think there's changes you can make to land value capture mechanisms that change that fact, especially without being disruptive to land supply. But yeah, that's all right with that.
I think I would agree with everything that's said. Land value capture is absolutely essential. I think, and probably we'll get to it in later questions, the problem is it's been an issue grappled with for a long time, and it's finding solutions, because it's very easy at high level. I completely agree with the comments that was made earlier by Chris on urban developments, transport for London and transport for the metropolitan areas, and trying to capture value out of the benefits that brings to metropolitan communities. I think that's quite right, but obviously a lot of the development also goes on in the regions, and the market is completely different, and it varies even within regions. And I think from RICS point of view, we think the existing mechanisms of SIL was good when it's introduced, but it's not universally adopted. So You know, that doesn't make it particularly easy. We understand why it wasn't, because sites are so specific. That's why Section 106 is there. So we might get into, I think you might later be asking about, you know, how could we improve it with templates, standardisation, making things swifter and quicker and more efficient. But I think it's complex. And the biggest thing when I was preparing to come today that really brought this home to me is that you've got to start thinking of, obviously there's plan stage viability, where we're trying to get on the front foot. From the MPPF 2018, that was the original one, 2012, wasn't it? And the disaster there was getting rid of spatial planning at regional or wider level, because that's essential for this transport and this long-term infrastructure investment. So that went away. But in 2018, what did come in, which was really good, was front-loading planning, viability at plan-making stage, get a plan in place, you know, local community and authority decide what's going on in your patch, allocate the land, efficiently and fairly based on the data, and then basically, you know, we obviously come back at detailed design stage and hopefully deliver that. So I think my first question when I was coming here was, has affordable housing actually been delivered? Have we got a problem? And I was looking at the numbers that MHCRG have, because, you know, published data on affordable housing, and I just have seen trends of increasing numbers, right? There was a dip, COVID, that's come in, and there was a dip, and you could peg it, I think, specifically at the end of 2022, when there's a decision that the MPPF is going to be changed and we're going to tighten down on various bits of policy, change the levers. So we had the 2023 MPF, and numbers have fallen off a cliff after that. But now, the exciting positive news is I see big boosts coming. So it's all about, you'll get the consents, but how are we going to grapple with this issue and not put a brake on the boost?
Thank you all for your answers, sort of opening up this panel. Two follow-up questions, if I may. First one to sort of everyone: how do we, and I say we as Parliament, public sector, balance the priorities when we do capture money from land value? Is it investment in certain types of infrastructure? Is it affordable housing? Is it other things? There is really a friction there. Obviously, the best example of land value capture is a bit more TfL, train line extensions, where it's investing in a transport infrastructure over a larger period of a city. But how can you get land value capture that prioritises affordable housing or other forms of investment that's slightly different? And then the follow-up question to Anna, which you're saying, well, we don't capture all the increase in value. So from the businesses, the residents that have had their property prices or trade go up. Are there examples of best practice where you can do that? Because if a homeowner is sitting on an increase in their property, how are you able to capture that to pay off the Crossrail 2 extension or whatever? So is there good examples of best practice where we're missing out that other countries have pursued?
Shall I start with that last question? I think that's a fair challenge, and it is true that certain beneficiary groups are a lot more difficult to tap into and have taxes that target the uplift that they benefit from. I don't know of successful international examples where existing residential property owners and landowners have been successfully contributing some of that value uplift towards transport. But I think that's not to say it's something that we shouldn't be trying to do, because all evidence does point to the fact that that is where the largest value uplift is sitting. So some of the work that TfL has done back in 2017 found that from sort of 8 prospective TfL projects, around 75% of all of the value uplift flows into the existing residential property market. So it's a kind of a very much a missed opportunity if we just play with LVC within the 25% space, looking at developers and the businesses, but we completely ignore the largest chunk of the value uplift. And I guess there is a point around when is the best time to try and capture that value. It may be locked in a property, and it could only be released at the point of sale or transaction, for example. So there is a question of whether a transaction-based land value capture mechanism would work better in that instance than something that is annual and charged to people who may not have the cash available to make a payment. So hopefully that sort of deals with that point.
Jeremy?
I would say I think the existing system works quite well in terms, insofar as, to me, what I've heard from the government is we want a boost of housing, we want a boost of, I would layer it, so if I'm wrong, boost of housing, right behind that, affordable housing numbers need to go up, house the unhoused, and obviously infrastructure delivery, because everyone expects to see those things that's necessary with the increased number of dwellings. And I think the existing system, plan-led, works well, because obviously a part of that planning process that's been in place since the 2018, it's viability tested up front, it's affordable housing, the local area or the metropolitan mayor, someone is deciding what level that should be, what was it in the last plan, what do we need, it's looking at all the evidence and setting that data point. And obviously through the SIL, for those authorities, there's a list of education, you're contributing towards the primary school, the secondary school, so everyone knows how it works, and it kind of prioritises and brings the money in. The bit that's different, I think, or not different, that new that isn't captured well potentially is the urban metropolitan areas, and this bit that my colleagues down here know a lot more about than I am, but I'm very interested, obviously, we all know that, I know someone living in London and he had a rental property that was near to Ealing Broadway, the new line's coming through, all the agents are telling him his house is going to go up in value by 20, 30, 40%. So that is a specific area to look at, but I think my observations would just be, I think it's going to be quite complicated. I can't think of any example. Very laudable to try and capture it, but perhaps that's a long, important project, but separate from the rest of England, the shires and the smaller areas where a lot of development will take place, including in the north, and that we need to remember.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, especially the strength of the plan-led system, in that it allows you to set out what you need and then fund it to the extent that's possible. I would just add that in areas of low land value, where you have a very finite amount of land value uplift that you can capture, I think it's really important actually that SIL is optional, because that allows local authorities the flexibility to find that balance themselves. And if SIL was charged in an area where you're not going to get enough value to fund everything, then you are taking a portion of that out, and then you can only do what you decide are the priorities with what's left. Yeah.
I'll just quickly say that I think there's a sort of matter of principle and then pragmatism about how you use. This is a public asset. This is an untapped public asset. That's what betterment is. Betterment arising from the grant of consent and also from public investment. So I do think that the conversation needs to be reframed about why we are allowing public assets not to be effectively used in the public interest. That's the starting point for the conversation. Then you can get into the pragmatism, I guess, about how you actually use infrastructure spend, and that's more difficult. The difficulty with the current system, particularly Section 106, which is practically all we can do, but it doesn't work, is that it doesn't allow you to do an infrastructure first-led investment programme, because the money's being recouped after the fact. In Bicester, for example, in Oxfordshire, 8,000 units held up because we can't use the Section 106 money to pay for a trunk road junction. So this system does not work. It's simply the only practical route we currently have. So in standing that on its head, it's the connection, I think, between the basic monies we need to spend to unlock development, and to be really clear, planning system is not the problem to the housing crisis. I mean, that simply is a beautiful piece of mythology. We create the consents. The issue is how you deliver them. You can't deliver them without land value capture mechanisms, and you can't make land value capture mechanisms work without a principled discussion about that untapped public asset, and I think probably most importantly about the delivery mechanism that goes with it, rather than simply an abstract taxation method. It needs a development corporation or an active public authority behaving as a master developer.
Thank you. Moving on to looking at Section 106 reform. Maya.
Yeah, so just getting into some of that more pragmatic kind of application of how we do this. So the government has obviously said it's committed to strengthening the existing system of developer contributions. So just from your points of view and your organisations, what are the reforms to Section 106 that the government should be considering?
Will you go first? I would say the system works, but it's frustrating. It lacks transparency. And it lacks clarity. So I think, without interrupting the objective, which is boost housing, what we could do is improve the system in a number of ways. Section 106, unfortunately, I don't have to read too many of them, but once you've read one, the standard format is fairly similar, but obviously there are nuances specific to the development individual negotiations. So I'd say the main issue is, why isn't there a template for a 106 with the main headings in that's sort of national? You can tweak and vary around it, because we know that sites vary. Local authorities and where they're used might want to make some adaptations, but like you have a sales contract for a house or whatever, a 6-month rental, why can't we standardise and make the system simpler? Why can't we capture and make the data more transparent? Like if I look at land and property and do due diligence, technical and planning, so it's, looking for a target site piece of land, and I'm looking at all the aspects, including viability. One of the things I'm going to want to do is look at the local planning history. What status is the local plan? When's the new one coming? All that data with digitisation is becoming fantastically available. There are, I won't name them, but there's lots of products out there. Last year we could go online and find out who owned it, what the local plans were, etc. Now I can actually, machine learning search and go, I want to look for 106s in this area, North Somerset, let's say, because I'm looking at a site, but they're not necessarily all published and online and available. So some of it's becoming less murky, if you like, because instead of me, having to phone round and say who knows of one, or try and find one where it gets published online with the planning history, I can, through the machine, find a few more. But to me, why isn't there a public register? Why is it not more transparent? Why can't I go to a register in an authority that I'm working on and see, what's historically been agreed? How relevant that will be would depend how new it is. We know there are all these things of, it might be a bit different, the site's different. But the two things are standardisation, access and transparency in terms of information.
And what are the reasons that people would give for why that hasn't happened? Is it just the lack of leadership in saying we need to standardise this? I would say so. I think from local authorities, I don't know what happens within them, but I know sometimes I can find them, redacted or not. Sometimes the data's there, it's all accessible. Sometimes it's not. I think it's just administrative within the authority. Depends on resources. It's not one of a national practice, if you like. So, for me, I look at lots of our local authorities. Some of their websites and access to information are fantastic, and some of them are awful, and that's going to be down to time, resource and money that they've got to do that. If we could, so that's as a professional looking day to day, it can either take you hours or it can be really quick to find the information. So if we can improve those things, support, as the government is, hiring some more planning officers, put some money in, I think we can move towards a better world.
Definitely agree about more planning officers. On reforms to the system, I think giving local authorities as much ability to determine what tenure they look for from Section 106 acquisitions. So I think the removal of first homes and affordable home ownership requirements we support very strongly. But beyond reforms to the system, we have to look at why it's not working perfectly at the moment. So I think the committee will probably have seen that there's around 17,000 homes allocated for Section 106 which currently are without buyers. And so there are two things with that. One is that RP, or registered provider finances, are incredibly stretched. They're having to spend an awful lot on their existing stock, which leaves less to acquire Section 106 homes. And so you've got a smaller kind of pool of demand. And then in some cases, Section 106 properties just do not meet the expectations and the requirements of registered providers. There are some issues with quality sometimes. And so the solution to those things are putting the housing sector's finances on a more sustainable footing, including through a new long-term rent policy that has to be viewed alongside kind of legal reforms to Section 106, and then creating better relationships and partnerships between developers and housing associations, bringing them in much earlier so they can genuinely inform the development process and make sure that they're the kind of the quality, the tenure, the type, the size of the homes that there is demand for, that meets the needs of their tenants and are easy to maintain in the future. I'd point to a recent report by L&Q and the G15 with a bit more detail about how that might work. And then also in the north, what we're seeing as devolution develops, we're seeing housing providers sort of coalesce into dedicated housing partnerships along the same geographies as the strategic authorities, and they're sort of acting as the direct voice into the mayor and the strategic authority. And what's happening in a few of those in the north is they're sort of coming together and developing a Section 106 spec, which is like, we've all signed up to this is what we expect from Section 106 homes that we acquire in this area, this is how we can help. And I think anything government could do to develop those across the country and roll them out would be really useful.
Could I add a very short one, which is the Homes England Register, and the funding is obviously, on point in terms of trying to help with some of those, isn't it?
Anna, talk to you.
Thank you. So I think we are talking about refinement to the system rather than replacement or removal. I'm not in the planning profession, so not able to speak to sort of the specifics of the reform required, although I know my planning colleagues at the Greater London Authority would be very keen to discuss these points with you, and they've made a few points in their submission as well. But I guess from the financial point of view, at TfL, we found Section 106 arrangements to be quite useful in terms of raising funding for some of our projects. Indeed, Section 106 agreements are raising millions of pounds for TfL projects every year at the moment. And we can point to two specific successes, which is the Crossrail Section 106, which was introduced back in 2010. It has since then came to an end in 2019 and amalgamated with the Mayoral Community Infrastructure Levy. But during that time of its existence, it's raised over £150 million for the Crossrail project, which was very helpful. And also the Section 106 arrangements we still have with Battersea Power Station for the Northern Line Extension project, which raised 210 million before inflation, and then when you add tender price index to that, the number is closer to 300 million. And that was a crucial component of the funding package for the Northern Line extension. And what makes Section 106 and SIL quite helpful is that they deliver funding upfront or during the construction phase of the project rather than after, which then reduces the amount of borrowing that we need to do during construction to pay for the project. So from that point of view, we found Section 106 to be quite successful.
Just really quickly, I would agree with all of that. Standardisation is important, as is bearing down on a system which is almost designed for the private sector to be able to game. That's why 106 is so popular with the private sector. It's a gameable system both through the process of viability testing. It's also gameable post hoc, which is interesting when people try to renegotiate Section 106 granted 10 years ago on the basis of viability constraints, and almost always that's about reducing affordable housing contributions. So all of the work in public policy over the last 4 decades has concluded that 106 is really suboptimal and really should be changed, and then never done it, partly because of those really profound forces I think you've had evidence on about why they're popular. But I do think that there's just a couple of things to add to the really good recommendations about practically what we do. One is that planning officers are like confidence. They've been beaten around so comprehensively by senior ministers telling us that planning is a blocker when it is no such thing, that the challenge is to have a profession who will stand up for themselves and public authorities and the public interest. I meet a lot of young planners who find that difficult when they're on their own in a 106 agreement and there's 7 members of a development team coming to see them. So we need that confidence, and I think elected members need to support them more, and that's all about local plan and clarity. Since we don't have a plan-led system in this country, because to have that you'd have to have plans, that's an aspiration, not a reality. I agree with the aspiration entirely. But finally, whether or not you do this through Treasury spending, this reinforces spatial inequality on a grand scale. Section 106 and SIL, as we've been debated, are reinforcing a development model that will break this nation. You cannot focus development solely in the greater southeast of this country indefinitely in the middle of a climate crisis. And although we've not heard any evidence about that, do bear in mind that we'll be spending almost all of this on flood defence in 10 years. You know, climate crisis is real, and it will revalue land dramatically. And I think the committee needs to think about land value capture in an era when development values are falling because of that challenge as well.
Okay, that's really powerful. And just finally, I believe Jeremy Ricks had put some evidence in around dispute resolution schemes. Do you want to talk to that briefly?
I missed that, yeah. I mean, the suggestion is that basically, obviously 106s are the final part to release the application to actually then get on and build. And they're notorious, as you say, for all the reasons that we've been articulated down here to take a long time to actually get to an agreement. And therefore, you know, one of the suggestions was as a modification that basically the application goes in, the clock starts ticking, and from the decision date, you know, within the period from the application being registered to the decision date, you know, the draft should already be in for the 106, and agreement should be reached at the end, i.e. without delay, and if not, it should follow a route of alternative dispute resolution. For example, that was the suggestion. In terms of points of dispute, just like with the Planning Inspectorate, the Planning Act 2008, you know everything that's agreed, but you've got the 2 points that aren't agreed, which will usually be money or percentage of affordable housing. You know, it goes into an expert and a decision is made. That's it. Binding. And that would unlock the housing.
And how realistic do you think that would be to achieve?
I can imagine there'd be quite a bit of pushback, but it seems, personally speaking, from a number of members, it was suggested because, on balance, we represent everyone, and decision needs to be made. It's not perfect, but a fair and equitable decision is necessary.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a question just in terms of some of the reflections we've had on Section 106, perhaps slightly further down the process, once the agreements have been made. We're aware that there are billions at the minute nationally of unspent Section 106 contributions sitting. I just wondered if the panel had any reflections on that, and I appreciate and just whether there is something in terms of the allocations that's creating that blockage, or whether there's something else that we need to be unlocking, because ultimately, if you've made the agreement, that's great, but if it's then not actually unlocking the investment that's needed, it's a failing system.
Yep.
I just comment, I don't know the intricacies of why it's locked there. I know it is locked there. I know it's a big sum of money, and I know everyone's very frustrated about it. I would imagine there's a multitude of reasons behind it, some of which is probably with the way these things are negotiated a bit piecemeal, this, that and the other, and things have changed, the application's old, the authorities looking at the forward outlook, thinking are collecting 10% of the money from here and 20%, and it's just not come out to plan. So you're trying to get the money to unlock a specific thing, build the new school or whatever, and the total pool of funding isn't there, and maybe they can't borrow. I imagine it's practical things like that. But to the point of transparency on what does the 106 say, what are the contributions, making members of the public fully aware of the land value capture that happens at the moment, in terms of what are they getting from the development, make that, disclose it, publish it, and also I think then, not a name and shame, I'm not for that, but a performance table of, who's got the money and where is it? It would help focus the electorate on, what's actually going on in their patch.
And I'd just add to that, the contribution of construction inflation is one of the biggest ones. So schemes that were ready to go and then 20-25% construction inflation means that they don't go. That's very much the kind of Bicester case study. It means that then local authorities are looking around for more money to deliver those issues. But that's why Section 106 doesn't work from really good placemaking, because infrastructure first led is the European model, how we built the new towns, and you have to get that right if people are not going to be car dependent. You go to Bicester, there's no dentist, it's difficult to get a GP surgery, education facilities flowing after, and all of those things then play into a political debate about why development is bad if you do an infrastructure-led first approach. So however we do this, 106 has to be, we have to be able to borrow against it, and you heard evidence in the previous panel about how that might happen.
Thank you. Could move on very swiftly. Sure.
Very swiftly, I'd no connection to me, but infrastructure first, urban and civic, big developer, it's the best development I've ever seen in terms of money invested up front, Homes England, project finance from the city somehow. I can't quote you the affordable housing, but trees, plants, cafe, school in before the houses. Amazing. So I will look up the affordable housing. Maybe I'll drop a note in.
Thank you.
If they delivered.
Lewis.
Yes. So viability. So I suppose let's just set some context here. So there's lots of unspent 106 money, because there's never enough 106 money given. It's obviously, once the council gets the 106 money, it's a political choice around whether they housing, infrastructure, etc., etc. But every time I've been involved in negotiations or been on a planning committee or anything to do with that, viability always comes back and says, well, we can't afford what you're asking for. It never comes back and says, do you know what, there's loads of money in this development, Lewis, and you're going to get everything you want for the council. We're going to meet all of the council's policies. It just never happens. So viability is kind of a load of nonsense, because I know it's going to come back and say, we can't do anything that you're asking for, and now we're going to start negotiation. And I suspect when developers go to external bodies about it, they want to give as less as possible, because obviously the less money they give in 106 means they make more money. So what's your comments on viability? I mean, personally, I think it's a load of nonsense, because I know it's going to come back and say, I can't give you anything. So what do you think we need to change with viability?
I would say that I think the system since 2018 has been getting better, is more and more data-driven, better data-driven. I went to an inquiry, I don't know, on a joint spatial plan 8 years ago, whatever, and it was like quite good, stemming out all the modelling, etc. What are all the costs? What are the values? You know, the bit that's being debated, and that was at plan stage, okay? And obviously that was going to set the affordable housing and everything else. So the models that are used in terms of working it all out, at plan stage it's obviously completely different than at detailed design, because you're site specific, but there's shed loads of data coming in, and it's verifiable, authentic evidence now that's used. There are a relatively small number of RCS and other professionals involved advising local authorities, but that data's coming from, you know, building cost information service in terms of the construction costs and all the inflation and everything else, and that's moving towards, it won't be long and it'll be live data. You know, sales information is coming from land registry, actual sales data. Improvements, we might come on to that, so I'll come back to that, because there is some stuff, we could get the information quicker from land registry, because that's about 12 new build stuff coming out 12, 18 months late. You know, so that's a delay in the system. But we could move towards it being better and being live. So what I'm saying is, I spoke to someone a couple of days ago in preparation for this who's involved in that sector, and I was trying to convince them, hey, couldn't we make this more transparent with the public and everyone? And I think everyone needs to see the benefits. Yeah. You know, what's happening, where's the pie chart on your app, right? And it tells you, you know, the cost, the value, the this, and this is what we're building. And then he told me on the modelling that you see to actually set the parameters, because within a local authority area there are so many variables, he's running 30,000 iterations at plan stage to actually look at which areas could afford how much housing. And I could give you an example. North Somerset, for example, their local plan, they set out with a target, it's 30% affordable housing, we want to get to 40. Right, that was going to be the blanket thing. That was their draft stage plan. And then they had the viability modelling done by the experts they'd employed, and they ended up saying the nuances of price values in our area is such that we will get affordable housing delivered on brownfield lower value sites at 20%, and we're going to they are intending to set the cap at 38.5%, not 40, to make sure they get the delivery of affordable housing and all the other SIL contributions and things that are necessary. So I would suggest that when you drill into the detail, it actually works very well. Everyone's not aware of how complicated it can become, and not seeing that I've got a view. My pie chart's probably too simple, but you know, where's it going? Who's getting that value? What's it going on? And there are problems in the system in terms of it's getting captured, and maybe it should, you know, it's getting sat on, or it should be going on something that is more of a regionally spatial, sensible transport project or whatever. But that's another argument. And then you're bringing in the metropolitan areas. It's how do you capture that money? And I'm ignoring that bit at the moment, because I'm a rural guy out in most of all the world bar urban areas.
I disagree. I don't think it does work, and that.
I mean, the challenge is that viability testing is a construct, isn't it? And it depends whether you agree with the values that are being attached to each element of it. Yeah. It's done immense damage to outcomes, there's no doubt about that, because it's rebalanced the process even further, I think, away from public interest outcomes and into the outcomes for the development industry. And those two things, by the way, are not aligned very often, plainly. But just thinking about land, why the question is so important is it relates back to the betterment question. The proportion of the pie chart that we spend on land has increased for housing development immensely compared to the 1950s, for example. So actually, in most cases, what we're saying to developers is you paid too much for the land, right? And that was your problem. And now you're telling us that you can't deliver the public goods that we've asked for because you paid too much for the land. Guidance says price paid for land is not a reason for non-compliance with local plan policy, which is should be tattooed on every planning officer's arm. But that said, it's still a highly gameable system. And so the problem we've got is that, let's think about that land value from the first principle. The increase in land value at the grant of permission to public asset belongs to us. That public asset's essentially been, if you like, sold off. The landowner is benefiting from that public asset. And because that price is too high, proportionately, developers are preserving their 20% profit margin per unit and therefore saying we can't do any of your policy compliance stuff. Essentially on most developments, and this might be heresy, by the time you've paid for really good infrastructure and all the requirements of that land prices would almost be zero rated. Because that's actually the economic price that land is worth to develop it to the standard that we want it developed. That's called right pricing land, and it's actually the simplest and most effective market-driven mechanism for land value capture. But it doesn't work because our planning system's too gameable. Every local plan, and every developer knows this, can be gamed. And they game away the policy requirements in your planning committee, and you end up with very little. Strengthen the plan and be clear about the expectations that landowners can realistically get from their land.
I suppose the problem with that is when you've put those policies in the local plan and you've determined that plan application and said, no, that's not in compliance with our local plan policies of 40% affordable or whatever that may be, they will then take their council to appeal and win. So there's no point having that. If that was a safeguard, then land values wouldn't go up as much as what they do because developers would understand they've got to meet these policies, otherwise they wouldn't be getting planning permission. But the fact they can circumnavigate that pushes prices up for land value because they know they can get around for not delivering that.
And that's why it's important to bear down on the gameable system. And the Levelling Up Regeneration Act gives more prominence to the development plan, but that's not been brought into law yet, so we're still waiting for that to happen. But that is all about a sense of maybe the most simple way we can get out of this complex issue, which is develop requirements which cannot be gamed. Then the developer will say, I've paid too much. If it's been optioned, renegotiate the option. They'll say we've paid too much, in which case, and then we won't develop, in which case local authorities need to be able to say, in which case we'll compulsory purchase land and we will build it out. And with that is a system that works, but it's very radically different from the one we've inherited.
Andrew.
Dr. Harris, just briefly, because you've said repeatedly it's a gameable system, I guess my question is, what are the rules of the game that you would change and first? What's the biggest change you would make?
The biggest simple change is that if you want an effective system, you need the public sector to be able to set standards which cannot be gamed away through appeal decisions or in other mechanisms, and viability testing contributes to the gaming of that process. And that said, once those standards are there, either nationally or locally, the idea essentially is that the land market would adjust over time. The difficulty is the adjustment, and that is a real issue. How does the land market adjust in the medium term? But just in relation to most pieces of land in this country, the increasing cost of infrastructure is going to mean that happy period from the 1960s to now, where landowners have taken super profits out of the development process, is over. And the question is how we move gradually to make that understanding clear by reducing the amount of gaming in the system. A development corporation is the prime example of how you end gaming in the system.
Jeremy.
I just say I don't know whether you've analysed the data, but and I haven't in great detail. You might do more data analytics than me, but I think it's really, really important just as a counter to that, to effectively say 2018 the MPPF was supposed to be, the rules, if they are applied properly, it's a front-loaded plan-led system, determine viability in terms of affordable housing, all those contributions at the front end with the plan. Local authority make their choice in terms of how they're going to allocate the land, involve the public, data driven. So on terms of like price, like rather than not the amount paid to the land, the sales price, it's coming from land registry sales data, the market. The cost is coming from building cost information service to do with tender stuff. It's going to be live data. So we're down to, are we overpaying for land? And I think the really important point is the whole reason for 2018, the update to the MPPF was happening. You had this. Everyone wanted to break the circularity. Developers overpaying for land, coming out and saying, oh, well, I bought it now, I want to do the development, but I can't put any affordable housing in. Sorry. So that absolutely, historically, became a squeeze point. But I think if you look at the data, I would suggest to you, and I know from market values, etc., things are on the turn and improving.
Okay, a very quick observation and a reflection point. So I guess this question is very much focusing on the development community as the beneficiary and as someone who is gaining uplift in their land values as a result of a planning decision or infrastructure investment. And I think it's fair to challenge how that viability assessment system works and make improvements if necessary. But there is also the kind of the wider context, which I've mentioned earlier, that we do have other beneficiaries of public sector actions in play too. And it's quite important that we try and capture value from those beneficiary groups as well, not just the development community.
Maurice. Thank you.
Just moving on to the community infrastructure levy, and I think, Tom, you probably already answered the question earlier that I'm going to ask the others, which is, why is it only at about 50% uptake from local planning authorities, and should the objective be universal coverage?
Yes, so it's 32% of local authorities in the north charge CIL currently, and its land values are lower. Far higher proportion have consulted on a potential regime, have modelled the impacts, and they've decided that there is little or no additional value to capture through that without jeopardising private development in their area and ruining scheme viability. They have also decided that we can't use CIL to fund affordable housing. We would rather use that finite amount of developer contributions that we can capture to help address the housing crisis, and that is their decision to make, in my view.
Anyone else want to add to that?
Only that I think there's unfinished business maybe in the CIL review team report from 2016, which had some positive suggestions about how it could be applied nationally. That's certainly worth considering, but they don't in any way overcome the fact that development values aren't there, I think. So there are ways of improving the CIL regime technically.
What did you make of the idea of switching to the infrastructure levy?
I think that the infrastructure levy is ultimately a good idea. I think their recommendations were positive in dealing with that, and also the recommendation to try and make the system procedurally simpler, which is basically underpinned that recommendation. But all of these things seem, I think the best word is sort of tinkering with the fundamental issue about how much value it creates, and that doesn't get away from the fact that Gateshead and Kensington and Chelsea, turns out, are rather different housing markets.
There are lots of issues with CIL within Kensington and Chelsea, by the way, which we won't get into, but even at a micro level the distribution is very unequal. But anyone else want to?
I guess from kind of London perspective, it's MCIL.
Yeah.
The take-up of CIL in London is significantly higher than in some other parts of the country. I think 34 out of 35 boroughs have got their own CIL, borough CILs, albeit some of the land uses may be nil rated to reflect the kind of the value dynamics in specific parts of the city. But MCIL, the Mayoral Community Infrastructure Levy, has been in operation since 2012. It's done an incredible job in raising funds for the Crossrail project and continues to do so. I think the original target we set was 600 million in combination with Section 106, so kind of 300 million from each source. MCIL exceeded that number and went well beyond it. The total amount raised now stand at 1.3 billion to date, and it is definitely a very important component of the Crossrail debt repayment profile. And I think just to reflect on the peace review back in 2016, if my memory serves me right, MCIL was picked out as a kind of a good example of how a CIL can be made to work due to its simple charging structure at the time, and a broad geographical coverage. So I think those are the strong points in its defence.
Lewis, you want very quickly?
Yeah. Do you think there's an argument that councils should do both? Because there are some examples that if used effectively, you can get large amounts of money out of 106. But obviously, if you're building less than 14 dwellings, you don't pay any 106, but you can charge seal. So do you think on smaller developments, where a council is using 106, they should be allowed to do seal on the ones that are sub 14 and then still negotiate if they want to do 106 still for both? Do you reckon two can work in tandem?
At the end of the day, there's going to be a finite amount to capture, but whether it's done, which way it's done, I'd say, if anything, on those smaller sites, you're talking about the smaller medium builder that we want back into the market because there aren't any. So if we come up with a system where it's SIL and you know what it is, it's fixed, it's simple, it's easy, it's transparent. If we're all happy with it, fabulous. But there are obviously shortcomings in the way that the whole system works at the moment. We're trying to all suggest improving. So in principle, yeah.
Anna, are there any further lessons that you'd like to kind of highlight in terms of your experience of how land value capture has been used as part of that Northern Line extension scheme? I know you've spoken at points this morning about that, but
yes, sure. So I guess the funding package for the Northern Line extension was quite innovative in its time. Just to recap what that was, about 2/3 to 3/4 of funding is coming from the incremental business rates levied within the enterprise zone within the Vauxhall, Nine Elms and Battersea Opportunity area. And about a third is coming from the developer contributions. The majority of that is coming from Battersea Power Station as a kind of an anchor development within the area. And I guess the reason why the enterprise zone component in particular was successful is due in large part to the fact that this is a prime part of, in a sense, central London that laid underdeveloped for many years. And so the business rates baseline of that area was quite low. And because a lot of the new development that is happening within the area is commercial rather than residential, there was a strong argument and rationale for creating the enterprise zone using the business rates as the tax of choice to raise the funding. Do I think this model can be recreated in other parts of London? I think the opportunity for that is quite limited because there are limited places where we will see significant amounts of new commercial development being delivered. There are, however, many parts in London where we can accommodate greater levels of new residential development, and this is kind of echoing back to what WSP and Business London were saying about the resitive model. So a model that uses residential taxes rather than commercial taxes might be more applicable in those circumstances. And going back to the NLE and kind of the lessons learned and the success that we had with that, I think another important reason for that success was the close collaboration between TfL, Greater London Authority, the local boroughs and the central government. Essentially, central government stepped in and enabled the creation of the enterprise zone, an ability for London to retain that incremental business rate instead of it going back to the Treasury for 25 years. And also HMT established a kind of a worst case scenario safeguard. So if incremental business rates don't materialise at the speed that we expect, and it takes us longer than 25 years to repay the Northern Line debt, then the safeguard is the ability for us to extend the enterprise zone by an additional 5 years, which is a great approach to kind of manage that financing risk.
And just conscious of time, but moving on really probably for you, Hugh, thinking about new towns, what sort of land value capture tools could you think would be most effective in supporting those developments?
I think if there was one thing we could do now, and recognising the government's exploring it, it is a new programme of new towns for the reasons you've heard about, but they are total planning, and therefore they present the most effective and efficient way of land value capture that exists. A public corporation is buying land at current use value or close to it in the original model through compulsory purchase if it has to, and it's using that uplift and development values that are created through the development of the town to recycle, to pay down debt and pay for future infrastructure. There's a but, of course, and the but is you have to have upfront loans or investment to kick that process off. And that gets back to some of the issues you've heard from previous witnesses about where that money could come from. But ultimately, the New Towns programme housed 2.8 million people in 32 places, designated in 20 years, that paid for themselves, paid back Treasury in the early 2000s, all of the fixed rate loans that were given to Mark Is. The Mark I New Towns were so profitable they were lending money to other public bodies. So the model of land value capture is there. The question is on what scale you can apply it, because that deals with a small proportion of development. The point is that that kind of total planning, so long as you can get the democracy right, which is probably for another time, is the way that you deal with effective development. And it's the model of infrastructure-led development which applies right across Europe to some degree or another, public sector authorities de-risking. And that's the heart of really good planning. That's how you build Freiburg and Copenhagen. Those are the models that really work, or the Dutch model that really works. So it's important that they get rolled out. In the short term, though, I think it should also be about local authorities needing to play that master developer role on smaller sites. They've got the powers to compulsory purchase any land earmarked for development in their development plan, but nothing like the money resources or capacity to do it. And that capacity issue has been well made by other witnesses.
Thank you.
Just conscious of time, just one final question for me. Obviously, for many of you, been here, done that, got the T-shirt and the stamp. In terms of 2018, a predecessor committee looked at this. Some of the written evidence we've received is saying that for the government to get this right, we need to be more radical. Instead of tinkering around the edges, some have asked to replace council tax and business rates. Do you think this would be feasible? And in your view, obviously, do you think land value capture would help the government in terms of building 1.5 million homes?
I think within this Parliament, in the context of 1.5 million homes, I am averse to radical reforms. I think we have a very bad and worsening housing crisis. Our members are committed to doing everything they can to help with that by building more homes. And the way that we want to do that is by consistently increasing the amount of development we do every year throughout this Parliament, because we are going to have to overshoot our annual allocation by the end of this Parliament if we have any chance. Anything radical on the land market, that could freeze up. And I have to stress again, I know it's been a very well laboured point, local authorities do not have the capacity to compulsory purchase land at any kind of rate to compensate if land isn't coming forward voluntarily. And just a little bit of extra information on that. So in the last 5 years, there have been 157 compulsory purchase orders actually completed. 83 of them have been in the north, so slightly more. But only 35% of local authorities in the north have actually carried one out. Only 20% have done more than one. So that's the level of actual experience that we have in the sector of doing CPOs. And what you tend to see is a very small number who have done multiple over the last few years. So I think in some areas the capacity just isn't there, and that will take time to build up. And then on feasibility of something more radical, as everyone on this committee knows, we haven't updated council tax valuation bands in 34 years.
Keeps coming back, don't worry.
Exactly. So I'm sceptical as to how we can design a new land value system, consult, implement it, establish transition and protection arrangements, and then build some houses on that new basis. Yeah.
Anyone else? Final comments?
I'll make a really quick point. I think radical reform of existing land value capture tools is not a good idea at this point in time. As Tom said, it's going to put pressure on the delivery of housing rather than help it. But I do think thinking widely at the question of land value capture is a good idea to start the process now, so that in medium to long term there may be tools available to help us deliver infrastructure and housing that we need further down the line. it doesn't have to be done in one radical reform route. There can be incremental changes along the way. You know, reforming council tax is a very big task, but thinking about something like additional precepts on council tax within specific zones may be a route forward.
I just want to leave one. You did say radical thoughts. Land inequality and property is one of the greatest sources of inequality in a nation, which is riven by inequality. I agree entirely that we're not going to unpick Section 106 and SIL to deal with that. But I do think that the committee just needs to think hard about that original logic is we nationalised development rights in 1947. Why are we letting a public asset be captured privately without sufficient response to dealing with public interest outcomes? And while that isn't a general point, it actually slowly helps redistribute land wealth, and that's important if you want a more equal society.
I would say because we have a free market. You know, everything's pegged by everything else. Your own house, your own extension. So although metropolitan areas, you know, capturing investment in London from big TfL projects, etc., is something to roll out. You know, just be careful with a transition to something else. You know, the market's balanced. We got loads of trains at the stations waiting for new plans to be created. That's where this needs to start, and there's been great moves on it. I think the numbers will come. So I think it's tweaks, and if there is a big change, and if that's what everyone wants, then effectively, you know, set it out here and transition towards it. But I just feel your targets are deliverable, but they're very challenging, and all of this should be done over at least 2 parliaments.
Thank you. Thank you very much for attending the committee this morning.
Thank you.
Order.